So my book at the surface, and even from my own perspective, comes from a place that I thought was really unexpected. Ybor City, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it is a small community located on the eastern outskirts of Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, Florida, where Tampa, Florida is located along the Gulf Coast of the state of Florida. It is one of the longest lasting Latino communities within the state of Florida. And it is the community that created the economy that began Florida's transition from a state that was rather rural with limited economy to one that became a leader within the broader South region. It's also the place in the state of Florida that began to shift the population of what Florida was. From Florida being a southern state that was split between Black and white populations to one with a broad and large, thriving Latina, Latino, Latinx population, especially one of Cuban descent. So Ybor City, to me, and the questions that led to this book, they come from a really humble place. Right? In my bio, I'd explained my family's from Ybor City. And to me, and for so long, there was nothing that was particularly special to me about Ybor City. I always say that it was around me so often and in so many ways my entire life that it felt as natural as turning on a water faucet. So the idea that there was anything particular about this place that was notable or even historic was something that was abstract to me. I know when we're all in this room and we're thinking about what brought us to be historians, when I was at an earlier point in my life, what to me seemed important and what I loved were these more official forms, right? People who seemed important, which were not people who I thought of from Ybor City or those who were a part of my family. And I think it's a testament of what we don't oftentimes think about, of how the role that we all play in our students' lives as professors and the questions that we ask, of how those can transition the way that we understand the places that surround us and how everyday lives and how things that seem so natural can be elements that make and create history. And to me, that happened in an undergraduate class when I wrote a supremely, must have been moderately okay paper proposal for a research class. And I was called in, and this professor asked me, he didn't even address my paper proposal at the time. And he instead just said, tell me about your family and tell me about the things that you celebrate. And I did. I talked about Noche Buena. I talked about the things that were defining to me. And he stopped me when I started to talk about May Day. And he just looked at me perplexed and he asked, did you know that this is a holiday associated with the Communist Party? And I was like, nope, had no idea. And it was from then that I started to ask questions about what this meant. And the more that I did, the more that I realized that ideas of Latinidad that surrounded me as an undergraduate student, the idea of being Cuban, being a different experience within the state of Florida, depending on who you are, where area and what community you come from, and what migration-based histories your family has a profound and lasting impact on both individuals, on communities, as well as the shape of the state. So my book, Ybor City, Crucible de Latina South, it centers on those questions. It tells the story of 3 generations of women who immigrated to Ybor City from Cuba. So they immigrate to Tampa, Florida from Cuba, and how their ideas of politics, of themselves, and of their place change over the course of those 3 generations. The period of time that I'm centering on are the years predominantly between 1880, but I do give you context and go way back. I tell you the whole story of the state of Florida if you've ever been interested. And we end in the 1970s. And during that period of time, you watch both the evolution of people as well as the evolution of place. And so I describe that my book is a story of how people, places, and politics become who and what they are. My book is separated into, there's 6 chapters in total and 4 core chapters. The 4 core chapters are building, resisting, surviving, and remaking. And those chapters, they chronicle both the core elements that created the community, as well as the core elements that shifted individual people. So you are simultaneously throughout the book watching the evolution of a place, as well as understanding how people and how individual based evolution happens over time. The introduction is searching, which is my own story of searching for this question and how I come to examine the book. And finding is finding it. So if you've ever, you can begin both with some interesting images. The last one that people locally like to comment on is the picture of my mom dressed up as Miss America, as a young Cuban Miss America of a costume that my grandmother crafted. Right? So juxtaposing images of how these shift. Within my book, I argue that Ybor City was an international borderland. And when I talk about borderlands, one thing that I really work to hone in is to think about a borderland not always as the way that we imagine it as in terms of a nation state, but in terms to think about borderlands much more from the concept of how scholars within Indigenous studies think about borderlands. Scholars like Brian DeLay talk about borderlands as though they are spaces of contested authority, where it's not always about where a district is or where there is a hard line of who it's entering and exiting, but how people are expressing and controlling different spaces, either through advocacy or either through claim to space or claim to land or claim to community or even the defense of oneself. And so what I look at in Ybor City is both where people are moving across borders as we would imagine them nationally, but also looking at the city of Tampa and looking at community and how in these early years, the idea of building, you have immigrants who are supremely powerful, who are able to control the politics of a Jim Crow state, who are able to advocate and take up physical space in a way that you don't expect to find in the South. But by the same token, within this, as economies shift, they have to find different ways to resist this. You can't have a Cuban cigar. The idea of the economy is principal to this. You can't have a Cuban cigar without Cuban laborers to make it in a very specific way. And when the economy and when the demand for that product starts to shift, the power that those who live within the community starts to change. They're no longer able to have the same demand and same control over the place and where they once lived. And through that, they initially begin to resist very actively through political engagement, and with time begin to change themselves. And within this story, the one element that I work to make sense of, and a message that I oftentimes send home to students. We're working on a biography project right now. So I was just speaking about this earlier today, and it's not in my list of bullet points. But to be careful and to understand who we make heroes out of and how we balance those stories, even when they are so dear to us. When I began this project, I imagined that I was going to write a book that was just about a bunch of really badass Latinas. This was what I imagined. But right, we always have to be aware of how people sit in our minds, even when they're our own family members, when our scholarship starts to intersect the personal. A crucial part of my story is how people can experience intense nativism, discrimination, and prejudice, but how they can also imbue those same ideas and principles onto others. And so my book, as it examines a space, how people come to understand themselves, how they survive within it, and how they shape it. It also looks at the different decisions people make based on the color of their skin, based on how other people understand them, based on the opportunities and choices around them, to how they choose to survive, either in proximity to whiteness as well as to Blackness. Thank you.